Welcome to Season 2 of the Culinary Saijiki podcast. This season, I'm going back to haiku's roots, pun intended, and focusing on how agriculture and food show up in the work of the classical poets. For more food and haiku goodness, you can read the blog at culinarysaijiki.com. And if you would like to be a guest this season, go to the blog and fill out the contact form. You can support the project by going to buymeacoffee.com/culinarysaijiki or simply share this show with whoever you think would enjoy it. All right, let's get started with today's topic. Welcome to the very first two-part episode of the Culinary Saijiki podcast. Before I get started, I want to say thank you to Kimberly Kuchar for buying me 3 coffees to support this project. Over on buymeacoffee.com/culinarysaijiki, you can make a financial contribution and get some bonus recipes if you want. Otherwise, the best way to support the show is share it with people you think will enjoy it. And you can also definitely, if you like the show, definitely go leave a review on your podcast platform of choice. All right, so the reason this is a 2-part episode is this is the longest recording I have ever done. So my guest this week is Patricia, host of the much-loved Poetry P podcast, now in its 6th series. And in season 1, I talked to Jerome Berglund for very nearly an hour, and then this past Saturday, Patricia and I talked for over 90 minutes. That is how long the recording was. And I decided, while I am a fan of like giant long form podcasts, not everyone is, so I've split it into 2 parts. This week we'll do Patricia's sort of history and cultural context and look at one set of translations. And then on September 27th, there will be part 2 where we'll look at the other set of translations and have the closing thoughts. I was really torn about how to cut it. I thought about just doing the history and cultural overview first and then leaving all of the translations for 2 weeks, but it felt weird to not end on any poetry. So we've got the first of our translations and some really great historical stuff. I had such fun talking with Patricia. I am so glad we finally managed to make it work. We are both very busy people, and there is that whole pretty serious time difference between us. So thank you for Patricia for being on the show, and we're going to talk about Buson and translation and food. And while there's still a ways to go in season 2 of this project, I am already thinking ahead to season 3, because season 3, my vision for it is big. Way bigger than I could ever execute as a single person. The theme for season 3 will be feasts and festivals. And I would like it to be a global celebration of culinary feast and festival traditions, just all over. But I am one person in one country, and I do not know, I don't know everything. I can't know everything. So in a few weeks, I will be putting out more structured details about how you might contribute to season 3. I would love to get as much participation as possible, so please stay tuned. Over on the blog, I have a longer than I expected it to be essay about the challenges of translation that I think dovetails very well with the conversation I had with Patricia, so go and check that out. I really thought it was going to be pretty short, and then, like everything, it ended up being super long. But I'm proud of it. I feel like it's one of the best pieces I've done. I feel like a lot of the things I've been exploring and thinking about are really starting to coalesce in a meaningful way, and I'm very excited about that. All right, so with that, I've got a pretty solid conversation for you. I want to dive into it. Let's go talk about Buson with Patricia.
Thank you, Alison, for inviting me onto the Culinary Sajiki to talk to you about Yosa no Buson. Now, when we first started talking about doing this, you might remember that you gave me a choice of which of the masters to talk about. And I chose Buson because I had the feeling he was a bit of an underdog. And of course, if you know anything about the English, we love an underdog, which probably accounts for my love of Crystal Palace Football Club. And I was wondering, Alison, what do you think? Do you see him as an underdog, or where do you see him in the pantheon?
I hadn't consciously thought about it until you sent me the draft of your script, but I absolutely like he's like the middle child. Like of
Exactly.
the he has like the middle child, like the joke is the middle child is always the forgotten child. And like
Hmm.
of the three really like ancient masters that we all know about, he is in the middle and he is the one who does, I think, get um the most overlooked. And you'll talk a little bit about the painting
Yeah.
aspect, and I absolutely agree, like that's absolutely part of it. But yeah, he does, I think, you know, but we all talk about Basho, and I think there's a lot of things to say about Issa, but yeah, Busan sort of, yeah, he gets overlooked a lot. So I think
I
it is
know.
good that we are talking about him today.
Excellent. And as you were talking there, I'm just thinking it's a bit like a boy band. If you put Shiki, who's actually my favorite, oh, and he definitely gets overlooked. If you put Shiki into the mix, you've got Buson, who's sort of the middle child. But if you think of it in boy band terms, there's always one of the boy bands that nobody knows, can never remember. And poor old Shiki, God love him, he's probably the fourth member that nobody can remember. But anyway,
He is. Absolutely.
so anyway, you're right. We're gonna talk a little bit, but only a little bit about the artwork. But I thought today what I'd do was give you a potted history of Busan, um, only a potted one because his story's out there, and anyone listening can fill in the gaps. I'd like to talk a little bit about translation, a little bit about haiku history, and some historical context for Busan's work. And most of all, most important of all, Alison, we want to look at Buson's poems, which feature food. Woohoo! Um, Now, Alison, I don't know about you, but Japan's history did not figure highly in my education in the United Kingdom. And I was wondering as I was going through this, what about you? Did you touch on Japanese history at all in school?
The most we got of Japanese history was the U.S. version of the events of World War II. So,
Okay.
you can just imagine how that went.
Oh yeah, okay. I think
I
I'm
will
gonna.
say that my paternal grandmother was a really devoted peace activist who really was very involved in the nuclear disarmament work,
Uh-huh.
and a lot of like reconciliation efforts between the U.S. and Japan, like civilian reconciliation efforts.
Hmm.
Um, and they had an exchange student from Japan who lived with them for many years, who then was just like a second daughter to them.
Oh, okay.
That maintained a relationship with her the whole rest of their lives. And I know that like my grandmother even had some of the traditional dress. Like they went to Japan. She visited Hiroshima. Um,
Oh,
but by the time that I was old enough to appreciate that, she was very ill with Parkinson's. So
oh.
I didn't get that much as much of that history of hers as I would like.
And you were telling me off air that you're heading off to Japan hopefully next year. Will you be able to follow up on the relationships that your grandmother had?
I am hoping to. Yes, this is all still
Oh,
very much in the proto stage. I was supposed to go in June of 2020, and we know how that went down.
yeah,
But now I am turning 40 in April, so I'm like, we've got to do something spectacular.
yeah. I absolutely agree. Well, I hope that goes well, and maybe there's a few podcasts in that when you get back, or as you go along. Actually, be really
Yeah, probably.
interesting.
Yeah.
Mm. Anyway, to go back to our education. I think I was sort of like you, but possibly had even less knowledge of Japan. We did touch on it in sort of World War II, but not too much. But then we're really talking about haiku today, obviously, and our relationship with haiku. And from what I've read, development in haiku in North America didn't really take off until after the Second World War. Although I suppose a case could be made that in the second decade of the 20th century, there was some involvement with the Imagists, but really that was coming out of London, even though Americans, well, London and Paris, but there were Americans involved.
Yeah, I would say a little bit the Imagist movement. I would say that's like very proto haiku. You know, I
yeah,
consider In a Station of the Metro, I consider that a haiku, even though it, you know, doesn't meet some formal constraints. But I think it's like it's got the spirit, even if it doesn't have the, you know, quite the technical things.
do you know what? I was debating that in my mind, not for this conversation, but I was reading another essay that was really saying that it was not a haiku. And I'm thinking, no, I don't know how you can make that argument. But then again, that's a whole other podcast, Alison. But yeah, I'm with you on that one. It's
Yeah.
definitely it was definitely early American haiku for me, if you like. But either way, I'm going to say that Europeans were ahead of the North Americans that are interested in the study of haiku. And again, when I was thinking weirdly about this podcast, I was thinking, well, why is it that the Europeans were ahead? And I mean, the obvious thing is that Europeans have been traveling and colonizing the world for centuries, and North America really didn't exist for a lot of that time, so no surprises there. And obviously the Europeans, given that they were often about traveling the world, were the first ones to head to Japan, and the Portuguese actually were the first ones that got there. And I don't think they did an awful lot of learning about Japanese culture, because they were more interested in selling guns to the Japanese, with some feuding warlords wanting to get hold of them. And of course, exporting Catholicism, which Europeans were very good at in that period of time. But that didn't go down terribly well, and the Portuguese got kicked out. And the Dutch, being a Protestant nation, filled that void, which I found very interesting. And Alison, you may already know this, but did you know that the first non-Japanese haiku, or the first Japanese haiku from the West, was probably written by a Dutchman? Did you know that?
I did not know that, but it does not surprise me given the Japan exhibit I saw at the British Museum this summer.
Ah,
They
fair
had a whole
enough.
collection of basically like Japanese portraits of Dutch people, because I do know that like Dutch people, like the Dutch traders, are one of the few people allowed sort of in some of the port cities during the closed off period.
That's right.
And they had on display this whole thing of like, here are some like characteristics of Dutch people and how they dress and what their mannerisms are. I'm like, that is amazing. I love this. But so I didn't know that, but it doesn't surprise me.
Oh no, I wish we'd had this conversation a little bit earlier. I've just got back from London, and I was walking past the British Museum, and I was tempted to go in because I think they've got the Hokusai. They had the Hokusai exhibition there. I don't know if it's still on, but I thought, I don't really have the time. And now I'm going to have to go back, and hopefully it'll still be on. But
Well, in May, the Hokusai was hidden for cleaning. I was so disappointed.
oh no.
And I
Okay.
know it's not technically the original, but you know, it's still one made with the same wood block. So,
Yeah.
yeah, that's a whole nother discussion of when is a piece of art the same.
Oh, we've opened up so many avenues of discussion already, and we've barely
We have,
started.
yes.
Anyway, I looked up this haiku by the Dutch bloke. His name, I should be more respectful, is Hendrik Duyf. He was alive until 1835. Do you want to hear it? I've got
Yes,
it
I
for you.
do.
Okay. Lend me your arms, fast as thunderbolts, for a pillow on my journey. Lend me your arm, fast as thunderbolts, for a pillow on my journey. Which apparently is about a young lady slicing tofu, and so quite appropriate for our discussions today. Anyway, to go back to why the Europeans were ahead. So, like I said, America didn't sort of exist at that point. If we go back to 1543, which is when the Portuguese discovered or found Japan, you've got four European nation states dividing up the Americas. You've got Spain, of course, mostly occupied in South America, but I believe they headed up as far as Kansas. Not sure they left much of a trace of themselves, but you might know better than me about that one, Alison. Any traces of the Spanish in that neck of the woods?
I haven't been to Kansas, but I will say in Colorado, I was very surprised in Colorado. some of the traces of things. But I've never been to Kansas. I realize the Kansas border is only 4 hours from me now, but there's just not a lot compelling me to go there. Sorry, no offense, Kansas.
Time. It's a time constraint, isn't it? Because you're a very busy girl.
I am. If they have HNA in Kansas ever, I will definitely be like, yeah, Kansas.
Absolutely. We'll go together. I'll hold you to it. Okay, so then we've got the French. They're further north. They found the Hudson, and the Portuguese have down south. They've claimed Brazil, and the English are poking around, sponsored by Henry VII, first Tudor king, and they are around Newfoundland and Maine. And I just wanted to point out that Britain is not a thing at this stage, so it was really an English discovery. So anyway, history is dictating that those good folks of the American continents probably don't know much about and cared even less about the point of first contact with Japan and the West. So we have interest in development of haiku outside Japan coming much later than our man Buson, who died, as we said, in 1783, our Dutch chap aside. So to study the haiku expansion, we should probably look at my favorite, Masaoka Shiki, who died in 1902, because that's the period when Japan was really sort of, well, Japan and the West were really starting to share cultural ideas, but we're not. So let's just say that North America really started to take to haiku in the 20th century after the Second World War. And you touched a little bit about why perhaps this was the case when you were talking about your grandmother. And I was thinking about it too, and I was wondering, why is it that that was the period that haiku really took off in America? And I wondered, did it have something to do with maybe a guilt complex about how America, and not just the US, so we're talking about the whole continent, treated the Japanese during the Second World War, the camps that they had? And I've just been reading a lot about that in Julia Otsuka's work. And I'd just like to recommend, if people want to read fictional accounts, they can have a look at her books, When the Emperor Was Divine, which deals with that, and The Buddha in the Attic, which deals with picture brides from Japan coming to the new homes in America, and touches upon this too. And obviously, again, we touched upon it, but you've got the atomic bomb, which brought Japan more into the consciousness of the whole of the Western world, and an interest in Zen philosophy. But why did Zen philosophy capture the American folks? Did it have something to do with the US personnel, military or otherwise, who were involved in overseeing Japanese post-war transitions in Japan? Was it an overwhelming need for peace, like with your grandmother? Was Zen seen as a way of bringing this peace into the world? And then, of course, we mustn't forget the beat poets, because their culture, hippie culture, brought Eastern culture and philosophy into our consciousness. And I wondered, have you got any more ideas why the US would have been involved at that stage, Alison?
I probably should have just asked John to be a guest today, because he could probably, as a historian, he could probably tell you. I think it's really complex, right? I think of my grandmother. To my knowledge, my grandmother never practiced Zen. She was a Methodist minister's wife. But I mean, she was one of those Christians that, even, I mean, she was, a minister's wife, but she was one of those Christians that she wasn't loud about. She did her social justice work because she was a Christian. That was what it was for her. I think for her it was, I think for a lot of peace activists, there was a lot of guilt, and a lot of sort of recognition of how just being an American, you were complicit in this. And she was, I realize I get my sensitivity from her. She couldn't watch I don't know if in the UK they have the Warner Brothers cartoons, but it's the Roadrunner and the Coyote. And the Coyote always gets her. She couldn't watch those. They upset her too much. She didn't want to deal with cartoon suffering. So she was someone who was just, I think, very attuned to suffering. I think there were a lot of people that were like that. I think a lot about Natalie Goldberg, who she did a lot of work with Zen and writing practice as an approach to an American approach to Zen.
Mhm.
And I know for her and for many people of her generation, like Zen was a spiritual practice that could make up for something that many people felt was lacking in the organized Western religions that they'd grown up with.
Okay. Mhm.
And it was something that people wanted some sort of spiritual outlet that you know the Natalie Goldberg comes from a Jewish family, but like the Jewish faith hadn't been able to find it there, or not, they hadn't been able to find it in Catholicism. And Zen was also something that could hold space for both. You could practice Zen and you could observe Passover. You didn't have to choose. I think there was some of that, and also, there were people who after World War II uh, didn't want us to have anything to do with Japan. They really vilified the Japanese. Natalie Goldberg writes about her father being upset with her when she became really committed to Zen and saying, I fought them, and now you're practicing
Yeah.
your religion. That's a paraphrase. So I think we like to talk about how the US is more divided than ever before, and I'm just not sure that's true. I just think those divisions, we can see them more now, like the cracks are really there. So I would say it's a lot of these cultural things. It's a lot of this sense of like guilt or responsibility of like, we have made this whole mess and now we need to do something to clean it up. And there are people who weren't into that at all. And and not every haiku practitioner, I think, was or is someone who is a countercultural person or more of a liberal person. Uh, but so I just say it's complex, and I think a lot of people came to it from different angles for different reasons.
Mhm. I know. It was. I mean, you've opened a whole can of worms for me here now. I'm gonna have to really have a look at that. Maybe John can come on to the Poetry Bee podcast and talk history with me on
Oh,
this one.
yeah, he would totally do that.
Cool. But people are going to worry that we're not going to talk about Buson. So let me just say, um, we'll talk a little bit about his life, but obviously your listeners have sought out this podcast because they know something about haiku, and I'm guessing they do know about Buson. But I'm just going to give highlights, and people can go off and have a look at him. So he lived in the Edo period, specifically from 1716 to 1783. His English language counterparts would be the likes of Alexander Pope, Robbie Burns, Samuel Johnson, Thomas Gray, and his artist contemporaries are going to be people like Goya, Canaletto, Hogarth, and Gainsborough. And we talked a lot about history actually, but what was going on when Buson was alive in Japan and here in the Western world? Well, from my point of view, from a European point of view, it was clear Irish famines, slavery, colonization by a variety of nations, and of course, right at the end of Buson's life, something very important to you, Alison, was going on: the American Revolutionary War. Or do you know it? Do you know it as the War of Independence? I'm never too sure which one we should go with.
It goes both ways. So
Okay.
yeah.
So that's where Buson was, right at the end of his life. That's what was going on. So a lot going on in the world. In addition, you've got the Industrial Revolution, trade is booming, middle classes are emerging. And so that's sort of the Western world. But in Japan, by the time Buson is born, he's born into a rural background. But the country itself has undergone a major population explosion and cities are growing. But do you know what was exciting for me, Alison, was to find out that during his time, education is expanding. Education, I mean, you're involved in education. You know it's really important. And it's possible that with a literary level of about 30%, Japan had the highest literacy level in the world during this period, which obviously was going to have knock-on benefits for the likes of Buson. Now, when he's born, his father is of a class that had the money to educate him. But depending on who you read, sources vary on where his mother came from, from just being people saying that she was quite poor, to suggesting that she had a variety of vices, shall we say. But it's clear that his mother was definitely from a poorer background than his dad. Nonetheless, he's educated. We know he has schooling, and we know he's well versed in Chinese poetry and its art history. And we can hypothesize that he almost certainly benefited from the increased demand for published work and the expansion of the merchant classes, because the merchant classes were mighty patrons of the arts, which as an artist was definitely a boon for him. Now, we sort of skirted about at the beginning and said that we both felt poor old Buson was a bit of an underdog. My opinion is his work's been undervalued by Western short form enthusiasts, possibly, as we said before, because he's sandwiched between Basho and Issa. But also, I wondered about his work as an artist. Does it detract from his work as a poet in some eyes? And another reason why he might be not as well valued as Basho, for instance, is it because he himself was responsible for a Basho revival, to bring Basho to the fore again. So, maybe that was why he isn't so well regarded. I mean, he is well regarded, but he's not regarded like a Basho. And then again, we touched, as I said, I'm not going to talk about Haiger terribly much because I don't think it's easy to do on a podcast, for example, Haiger being sort of the artwork and the poetry together. And again, I'm not an artist, so could it be here that the West, we don't have the tradition of art combining with poetry, and what we don't know about, we don't necessarily value? And then, of course, Alison, you stick photography into the mix, and it's really become, with our little phones, I mean, all of us have these little phones in our pockets that can take wonderful photographs, so they're the instrument now of the masses. And if you look at Instagram or apps such as Instagram, you're going to see Haiger in forms of photography these days. And I don't know which way that will take us. Will that make poetry combined with an image more valuable, less valuable? Will there be fewer instances of people actually putting pen to paper, sort of drawing things and painting things and combining that with poetry? Well, I don't know. So what is the future of Haiger? I mean, what do you think, Alison? Where do you think it's going?
I mean, I am also not an artist. Well, no, I actually, I love to work with textiles, but I do not paint. I do not draw. The one and only Haiga I have ever published did have a photograph in it. And I think that is potentially like going to be like something that does actually maybe make Haiga a little, that sort of like boosts its visibility a little bit, at least in the haiku in English sphere. Yeah, and I think, again, I'm not an artist, an art historian. When I think of the paintings that like get into museums, or I don't see a lot of combination of painting or drawing and poetry. I've certainly seen that in special exhibits. St. Louis Art Museum had a special exhibit on mid-century modernist painting by indigenous American artists, and a lot of them combined text and poetry. But certainly the stuff that like it is in the main collections, I don't see it that often. So yeah, I don't see the sort of mix of text and image as something that necessarily has a broader mainstream appeal. But I do think that photography is going to change that. I know Pippa Phillips, she's starting to do a series of they're not formally Haiga but doing some sort of like visual representations of haiku and some art on TikTok. She's making little animated
Oh,
things,
okay.
and they're really sweet, and I love them.
So I was going to say, then the next step would be using video, or animation in some form with
Yeah.
poetry. Oh, I must have a look at that and see what it's like. But I have to say, I've not taken to TikTok yet, so that will be a whole new venture for me. Anyway, to get back to good old Buson, he looked to Basho's work and to literature and art of the past to inspire his and his disciples' work and that of future Haikai and Haijin, advising poets in his day and us to learn from it, but develop our own style. And Shireen in Traces of Dreams gives us a haiku by Buson as an example. And it's not food related, unless, of course, you kill the frog and eat it, but we're not going to do that. And his example from Buson was this: the frog of the ancient pond grows old, fallen leaves. The frog of the ancient pond grows old, fallen leaves. And Shireen gives an explanation, but I'm going to do it in my own words. That famous frog and ancient pond that we have quoted at us all the time is referenced in Buson's work here. The frog's grown old, winter has come to the frog and to the pond. And I wondered, just in passing, is Buson also telling us that Basho's work, his style, and his craft has been forgotten? Because, of course, as I said, he was involved in a revival of his work. So anyway, there are many sides to arguments about haiku and its development, but I'm with Buson. If we don't know the history of our preferred form, how can we develop it going further? And to take that a step further, if we don't have an education in the poetry of our own cultures, how can we improve our own poetry, even if we're choosing to write haiku? How many haiku poets turn to the poetry of our cultural past when writing haiku? But more worrying for me is how many editors of journals are familiar with poetic history. And Alison, I'm going to throw that over to you. Give me your perspective.
Oh, I mean,
Oh dear, what have I
that is a can
started?
of worms. I'll try to keep it I'll try to keep it concise. I mean, I'm of the opinion that we just need to dismantle the entire United States educational system and start over. That's really where I'm at. I'm like, this is so beyond broken that we just need to tear it all down and begin again from scratch. But I think for me, coming from someone who did do two, I did an English undergrad, an English master's, and a creative writing master's. In many ways, there can be a lot of siloing and teaching literature as literature separate from history, and I think that causes a lot of problems. And not every school is like this, not every program is like this, but I do see a lot of just, here's literature and here's like maybe like a brief highlight about what was going on during that time, but not a lot. Like it doesn't really go deep. And I think we do need to be sort of going deeper into the history of the form and the history of the world, because you can't have the poetry without, like, the poetry is part of the context it is lived in or it came from. And so yeah, that to me is the big thing, is like we need more of that.
I would say I was when I was at university, and that is a long time ago, I'll give you that. I didn't study literature, but the subject I studied did study the history, put everything in context with the historical background as well. So I'm sort of with you on that one. But one problem we do have is obviously, if we're okay learning about our own culture and our own history and our own language, but once we start trying to explore and learn about, for example, the Chinese and Japanese masters that Buson was suggesting we learn about, I think we have an issue with translations, which I don't want to go into today too much, Alison, because if we go down, I think we're going to have quite a discussion anyway. But if we go down that route, we're going to be here for hours, and I'm not sure people want to listen to me for hours on this one. But I want to touch on it because although I'm not a linguist, I do speak a few languages. I'm from the UK, so it's a miracle I can speak anything other than English, but I live in the center of Europe. So obviously, if I'm going to go about my daily business, I have to speak other languages. And so I could translate for my own consumption. I could translate German to English and at a push a couple of other languages too, with a great deal of work on and quite a few dictionaries open. But I wanted to just, on that basis, talk about translation, because when a poem is translated from one language to another, things change. How can it not? And I want to look at a couple of things like formatting. So going back to our wonderful education system, most people, I'm guessing, learnt that haiku were 575 poems. And I know some people still hold to that theory, and I don't have a problem with it, other than being able to write something that sounds like a poem when stuck with a sort of rigid syllable system. So kudos to anyone who can do this. And we're going to hear some today, and maybe you'll have some thoughts on the ones we're going to hear today. But I don't think we can easily write 575. And if we just take a look at a few languages and a few ways to say goodbye, for example, goodbye, English, goodbye, 2 syllables. Auf Wiedersehen in Swiss German, 5. Sayonara, Japanese, 4. Au revoir in French, 3 syllables. So I think that in a very simple way shows you how difficult it is to stick to a syllable format. And then I know people are going to shout at me and say, well, there are lots of different ways you could say goodbye, and you could probably find one that says it in as many syllables as you need to fill in a poem, but that doesn't always work. So very hard to stick with a syllable format. And then there's the understanding, in order to translate, do you need to fully understand the culture, not just your own culture, obviously, but the culture from which you're translating? What if you can't and you can't communicate from one culture to the next? I mean, something's going to be lost. So something of the poem is going to be lost, which is why I like to spend a lot of time looking at Sajiki, for example. I mean, that's really important in haiku, trying to understand what that means. And we will get to it today, I promise you. Then, of course, there's when the poems are being translated and the biases, again, which we'll see in the poems that I'm going to read to you today. Because obviously someone is translating work within their own time and using their own bias. I mean, Tony Barnson, in an essay, The Poem Behind the Poem, Literary Translations as American Poetry, sorry for the long title, compares a translator and the poet to a musician and a composer, which I thought was brilliant. And I thought, Tony, you must have been listening to my piano playing, because he suggests that just because a musician can play the correct notes in the right order, it doesn't mean it's going to be great music. And Alison, if you ever heard me play something from Chopin, it would absolutely prove that point. I could probably do it right notes in the right order, but it would sound horrible. And so the translator may be a good translator. They may even be a good poet, but that doesn't mean that you're going to have successful translation at the end of it. And again, when you hear the translations we're going to hear today, I think some of them are going to illustrate that point. So I'm going to read you, at last, I'm going to read you a handful of poems from Buson by a number of translators, and leave you to be the judge as to whether the translators are the Patricia Maguire pianists of this world or the Vladimir Ashkenazis. So, Alison, my first one, well, I say it's my first one, but Jonathan Gage, bless him, who knew what I was up to, sent me this little selection, including one of his translations. Here we go. Some poems at long last by Buson. Mustard flowers, with the moon in the east, the sun in the west. Translated by Makoto Ueda. Field of bright mustard, the moon in the east, the sun in the west. Translated by Robert Hass. Field of mustard flowers, in the east the moon is rising as the sun sinks in the west. Translated by W.S. Merwin. Field of rapeseed, In the east, the moon. In the west, the sun. Translated by Joshua Gage. And I added one from one of the Poetry P podcasts, which was translated by Richard Tice. Rapeseed flowers, moon in the east, sun in the west. Now, something we didn't touch on before is that a lot of the verses we're going to hear will have been hokku, which means that and this one is just that, which means it was originally written as the first verse of a kazen, a renku. This one probably around 1774, so it's the latter end of Buson's life and career. To me, it speaks of immensity, possibly also of the stretching of time. It's spring, which we know because of the image of mustard or rapeseed. And I wonder also if Buson is cleverly showing us the days getting longer. And in some ways, it reminds me of this poem of Basho, translated by Blythe. A wild sea and the galaxies stretching out over the island of Sado. A wild sea and the galaxies stretching out over the island of Sado. And when I read this, I wondered whether Buson was seeking the same immensity that Basho is seeking. The vastness expressed through images of the sky in Basho's case, but as an artist with Buson, was it the colours in the landscape that attracted him? And then Ueda, in his book, The Path of Flowering Thorn, which, Alison, I have to say, I was a bit worried about reading, but it is a properly interesting book, suggests that this poem of Buson may have been influenced by a poem written by Tao Qian, a Chinese poet, which went, "The bright sun sinking on the western bank, and the pale moon rising above the eastern ridge. The earth looms in the rays of light that spread far out and reach all the corners of the spacious sky." I don't know who translated it. I suspect it was Ueda, but I can see what his point was. It does, to me, the two do link up, because we know that Buson had a sense of the past and that he valued the work and art of that came before him. And he's also he's also famous for having said that there are no ancients. So I was wondering, how do you balance these two thoughts? You know, in this poem about the mustard flowers, in whichever translation you prefer, he shows he knows his past. He's learned from it. But he's written something original and in his own style. And perhaps that's just what he means. You know work from the past, but when you write, create something unique in your own voice. And I thought that despite him writing about this in the 1700s, it's something we can identify with today. Certainly, it's something I see around me. I cycle past these wretched fields of rapeseed, hugely yellow, going off into the distance. And Alison, I quite dread it, because I just know that when I get home, I'm going to be coughing and sneezing all over the place with hay fever. But I wondered, do you have this connection? You've lived in a few states. Is it something you know and love about your environment, your landscape?
What specifically? I think I lost the thread a little bit.
Don't worry,
I mean,
love.
I'm following your thread, but like, what am I connecting to? Like,
what are you connecting to the images that he portrays? Can you see fields of rapeseed, mustard seed, maybe even sunflowers, although that would be a different
I actually, what I go to is what I was thinking when you read this poem was, I have never seen wild mustard yet. But when Jean and I go into Illinois to see his mother, there's a stretch of the highway for the past month or so that it is just sunflowers for miles. Like the median is full of sunflowers. There's a field that's full of sunflowers, and every time we pass, I go, look at those sunflowers. Like, would you look at the sunflowers? Like, it's, we go a couple, fair, like maybe 2 weekends a month, like we go up there for a day or two. Look at those sunflowers. Like, every time it's like I'm seeing them for the first time, and it's just we had sunflowers in Texas. Like, Texans love sunflowers. But Austin was a bigger city that was less country. Like, we're in the country in 15, 20 minutes where we
Yeah.
live now. And it would take a little more work to see big fields like that, whereas just, we just go, and and they really just go a couple of miles, and it
Mm-hmm.
blows my mind every time.
Mm-hmm.
And I love it, and it does make me feel, I haven't been able to like write a haiku about it, but it makes me feel connected to a lot of things. It makes me feel connected to, like, I'm not an artist, but it makes me feel connected to Van Gogh and his sunflowers.
Oh yeah.
um and it makes me feel weirdly, like, to my knowledge, Monet never did sunflowers, but like there is something about just like something that makes me like feel connected to like art,
Mm-hmm.
um in general. That it is a, in many ways, like kind of spiritual, and it makes you, yeah, really feel like you are like, anyone could see this, and someone could paint it, and someone could photograph it really well, and someone could write a brilliant poem about it.
Absolutely. But do you know, we should be talking about food, shouldn't we,
We should.
Alison? So
Well, sunflower seeds are edible.
that's true. That is true. But I'm glad you made that connection. I've actually cut down a load in my garden today, and I've left them out for the birds, just the heads.
Yeah.
But this time we're talking about the mustard seed. And I was interested in it, obviously here in Europe or around me. Like I said, I've got loads of fields, or I've had loads of fields of rapeseed, so they're going to be used for vegetable oil. And I found out that actually in Buson's time, that's exactly what they were doing as well. But also, which didn't occur to me till I started doing it, and it should have done, is that of course they needed the oil for lamps, because they couldn't walk into a room, turn on a switch and have bright light. So the field of rapeseed were really, really important, or mustard seed were really important for the Japanese. And that also got me thinking and moving on. Is there a connection to light in this poem? The brightness of the flowers, the evening light, the light emitted by the sun and the moon. Is he also perhaps expressing something about the state of the world he's living in? Because like we said before, you've got the Industrial Revolution starting. It's, he's going to be seeing this. He was born into a rural world, and he's seeing this takeover of machinery and whatever. So is he expressing something about that? The sun being sort of the wonderfulness in his environment, the moon, the darkness rising. It might be a push, but once I get started, I can go all over the place. But perhaps have a listen again anyway, and take note, Alison, of which translations you favour and why. I'm going to come back and test you. So, mustard flowers with the moon in the east, the sun in the west. Makoto Ueda. Field of bright mustard, the moon in the east, the sun in the west. Robert Hass. Field of mustard flowers, in the east the moon is rising as the sun sinks in the west. W.S. Merwin. Field of rapeseed, in the east the moon, in the west the sun. Joshua Gage. Rapeseed flowers, moon in the east, sun in the west. Richard Tice. So, Alison, what do you like?
These are all quite good. I notice you've given me a lot of very contemporary translations.
There are a few contemporaries. Maybe when we look at, there's some later on that I really want to have a look at, which might be easier to do a test with you. But just out of interest, what appeals to you in these translations, and what do you really not like?
I love. Well, I'd say Ueda is, I think, my favorite translator right now. I love the way in general, like, Ueda really manages to like capture the image in a very like simple way. So I love that one, and I think Joshua Gage did a great job as well, presenting the field, and then the two astral bodies in their respective planes. And I love, I feel like I can't like, I shouldn't say, like, give criticism to Merwin because he's such a great poet who did so many things.
Mm,
Um, and did you know that, like, like, he got into translating because Ezra Pound told him, like, that's how you become a good poet is you translate.
yeah, 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 yeah.
But I think uh, oh, no, sorry, it was Merwin is not the one. It was, Robert Haas. It's the word bright, like, I don't love it because you already mentioned there is the play of light in here. We've got the sun sinking, and that is like a fading brightness, and the moon gets its brightness like from the sun, but like the moon has its own, reflection of luminosity. So we've already got two sources of
Hmm.
light in the last two lines. So like to me, the bright in the first line, and we don't need three light references.
No, I'd
That
agree with you there, definitely, definitely. Um, and I think this is the only Merwin translation we've got,
Mhm.
unfortunately. And I'm
Yeah.
sure he's probably done better on other poems, but I just, again, I don't like to criticize because, like I said, if I translate something, it's purely for my own consumption because other people probably wouldn't want to
Oh
read it.
yeah, absolutely. Like I have, like you'd be like, can you do it better? I'm like, no, I could not.
Exactly. But I think, well, having said that, I think possibly you could in this instance because he he's told us too much. There's too much movement in, in the east, the moon is rising as the sun sinks in the west. He didn't need to really lay it on the line for us there. I think we could
Yeah,
have
we
figured
we
that one
know
out.
that happens. Like
Yeah,
probably if you're above the age of like 5,
yeah,
that happens.
yeah. So that's the only thing I would say. And again, it's not to criticize because like we both said, we're not going to do a better job. But that would be just one thing that I would go for that one.
Well, and I
Now the
think a
next
lot of
one,
it is subjective. Oh, real quick, I just want to say a lot of
go
it
on.
is subjective.
Yeah, yeah.
Like
Hmm.
someone else might think, oh, that Merwin one is fantastic. You two are wrong.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
and it is subjective, and I think there is something worth going through and like figuring out what is it you do and do not like, because that
Yeah.
reveals a lot about your own work, and it can be just a really good learning tool.
Oh, it's absolutely a good learning tool. And maybe, Alison, if people disagree with us, they can write to you and tell you.
Yeah, just go ahead and tell me.
Pass it on, tell me. I could learn too.
Thanks again to Patricia for being on the show. I think you can tell from that recording that I was having a great time. And thank you for being willing to split your episode into 2 parts. I know I'm excited to share the second half of that conversation with you, where we will look at more translations and have some philosophical discussion at the end. And again, that will come out on September 27th. I would say I was about an hour, a little over an hour into the recording when I realized this is just going to have to be in 2 parts, and I'm thrilled about that. This is also, I'm just going to tell this real quick, but this episode was a good reminder to have multiple backups and multiple solutions in place. I like to record with 2 separate mics. I've started doing that this year because it's hard when you're talking over Zoom. Sometimes you interrupt people when you don't intend to because you can't, they're on the screen, but there might be a lag. You might not hear that they're about to say something. So I like to record on tracks so that I can cut out if I've interrupted somebody. I can cut that out, or if my dog starts barking or the air conditioner kicks on, it's really easy for me to cut out any like issues on one track or the other. So it's a little more of a complicated setup, but for me, it makes for sort of an easier editing process because everything's on separate tracks. And I have started recording on Zoom again because that interfaces really well with the PodTrack recorder I use to record my guests. But I also recorded everything to the cloud for Zoom just in case. Just in case. And thank goodness I did, because the external mic I used to record myself, it's getting up there in years. I didn't buy it myself. It had actually John's. He used it many, many years ago when it was brand new and like super duper state of the art, like the hottest thing on the market to do audio history with his family, oral history, I should say. So this is actually, it's not just a mic, but it is nice handheld recorder with a really good mic. And anyway, I'm recording on it right now, and I can see that that cable is just not as fitting as well. The power adapter is not fitting as well as it used to be. Anyway, that came out. And so we lost a bunch of my audio. But fortunately, I had Zoom back up, and it was just mono track, everything on one track, which is not my favorite. But you know what? At least it was there. I can't even tell you how utterly devastated I would have been if that whole conversation, if we'd lost, my half of it. So just let this be your reminder. If you haven't backed up your stuff in a while, maybe now's the time. Maybe now is the time. Anyway, again, start thinking about, if you were to write a blog post about, or produce, or at least record, and I can do the editing, a podcast episode about a festival or a major cultural event in your country or religious, heritage that I might not know about, and you would like to feature on the show or on the blog in relation to haiku. Just start thinking about it now. Again, I'm still working out the details of how things might go, but yeah, just start thinking about it. Maybe check the calendar as to when major cultural or spiritual events that involve food are happening in 2024, and make a note and do some brainstorming. Otherwise, thanks again to Kimberly for the coffees. Go to buymeacoffee.com/culinarysaijiki if you want to contribute. Obviously, no obligation. I do this for fun and keep the overhead low, so for a reason. But the tips, they're definitely appreciated. Anyway, again, go back to the blog to check out my post on the challenges of translation, which really complements this discussion. And if you want to be on the show, there are still slots available. I have an editorial calendar sketched out, and it is all filled in. But there are some ideas that if you wanted to come on the show, I have some ideas that I would be happy to just let go of. Don't worry. So it's not too late just because we're halfway through season 2. It is not too late at all. So if you want to be on, head over to culinarysaijiki.com, click join the conversation. Let me know what you want to do. All right, and with that,